Whenever someone brings up to me Mike Flanagan's The Haunting of Hill House Netflix series, I don't know how to talk about it because I have such mixed feelings. I really enjoy the limited series, and I've actually watched it multiple times, but I'm also a big fan of Shirley Jackson's original novel, as well as Robert Weiss's film adaptation, The Haunting. As great as the show is, when it's placed alongside the texts it's adapting, it becomes complicated. And before I get into it, I want to make it clear that this is not a critique of the Haunting of Hill House TV show, but rather an analysis of how the show functions in relation to its source novel and film. A lot of people, including myself, believe the series is best viewed as its own thing rather than an adaptation. However, there's value in viewing an adaptation within the context of its source material. Just because something is best enjoyed from one perspective doesn't mean it can't or shouldn't be viewed from another. So even as I'm critiquing it, I'm not necessarily saying anything about the show as it exists in a vacuum, but rather the show as a text that exists within a larger series of works. Many fans of the show claim that the series is not an adaptation of Shirley Jackson's novel, but rather a reimagining of it. This word reimagining is even ingrained into the marketing material of the show. But when it really comes down to it, the two words can be used interchangeably and don't actually mean anything. An adaptation might reimagine a film as a graphic novel. A reimagining might adapt a story to a new time period. All adaptations are reimaginings, and all reimaginings are adaptations. So with that out of the way, please embark with me on the rabbit hole of why this TV show still haunts me nearly 5 years after its release. Since its publication in 1959, Shirley Jackson's gothic horror novella The Haunting of Hill House has been considered one of the greatest works of horror of all time. In 1963, a film adaptation titled The Haunting, directed by Robert Weiss, was released and has since reached similar praise and cult status, with everyone from Martin Scorsese to Steven Spielberg claiming it as one of the scariest movies ever made. All this is to say, Mike Flanagan's Netflix miniseries had big shoes to fill. When it was finally released onto Netflix in 2018, it received immediate praise from both audiences and critics. However, many horror fans were also disappointed at the series' departure from its source material, with one New York Times article mentioning how this series pays homage to Shirley Jackson while erasing her at the same time. Indeed, even as the Netflix series departs entirely from the story it's adapting, it still insists on linking itself to that narrative through overt but ultimately surface-level references. This is key to understanding why it fails as an adaptation. In the original story, Dr. Montague, renamed Dr. Markway in the film, invites a group of strangers to a haunted house, believing they each possess unique qualities that will help them prove the existence of the supernatural. These strangers are Theodora, invited for her psychic abilities, Eleanor, invited because of a previous experience with a ghost, and Luke Sanderson, a skeptic rich kid invited because his family owns Hill House. In the TV show, we follow the Crane family, taking the surname of the original owners of Hill House from the book and the first names of the original main characters. Hugh and Olivia Crane are hired to renovate Hill House, moving into it with their children Theo, Luke, Nell, and Shirley. Due to traumatic and possibly supernatural events that occurred during their time in the house leading up to their mother's suicide, the adult versions of these characters each have their own issues. Stephen is a popular horror novelist who doesn't believe in ghosts. Nell is a hopeless romantic plagued with sleep paralysis. Luke is addicted to drugs. Theo is a child psychologist who struggles to connect with others emotionally. Shirley is a conservative and shy mortician. And Hugh has been lauded as crazy by both his family and the tabloids because of their experience in Hill House. After Nell commits suicide in the pilot episode, the family must come together to reckon with their past trauma from Hill House, which is revealed through non-linear flashbacks. Now don't get me wrong, I'm certainly not someone who thinks that a remake or adaptation has to be exactly like the original. An adaptation should differ from the original in a way that still engages with the text it's adapting. Remakes and adaptations often form a sort of conversation with their source material. Look, for example, at the original Suspiria and the 2018 remake, both of which I love. Both films are about a ballet school run by a coven of witches, but while the original is very much a style over substance kind of film, the remake expands upon the characters and the folklore of the film, also placing it in a post-World War II Germany for added socio-political resonance. The remake takes that same story and finds its own value and perspective engaging with the original as much as it is speaking for itself. Or look at Bates Motel, a TV show adapted from Hitchcock's Psycho. Bates Motel places the story in a contemporary time period and explores the relationship between Norman and his mother that led up to the events in the original Psycho. In the later seasons of the show, Bates Motel actually recreates the events of Psycho, except Norman doesn't kill Marion Crane. The show chooses to explore what Norman's life would have been like had he not been caught committing that one crime. But even with these major differences from the source material, Bates Motel still has everything to do with what it's adapting, exploring and expanding upon the psychological relationships and locations of the film. Conversely, Mike Flanagan's Hill House struggles to really engage with its source material in a meaningful way. Sure, it's littered with references to the original and borrows character names, but it isn't really interested in exploring the content and value of the story beyond its most superficial scares. In fact, the themes the show does explore are often in such direct contrast to the original, it's almost disrespectful. That said, I can see how the original story may have served as an inspiration for the Netflix series. Mike Flanagan practically spells it out for us as he ends his Hill House series with the same lines as Robert Weiss ended The Haunting, with one notable difference.
Hill House has stood for 90 years and might stand for 90 more. Within, walls continue upright, bricks meet, floors are firm, and doors are sensibly shut. Silence lies steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and we who walk here walk alone.
Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House.
If I go, I'm going crazy.
And those who walk there
Let my darling take me there.
walk together.
Mike Flanagan took this idea of a haunted house as a space for lost and lonely souls and applied it to a disjointed family. But inspiration doesn't have to result in adaptation. Just this year, Ty West's film X is very clearly inspired by Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but was also very distinctly not an adaptation. So how does Hill House being a direct adaptation rather than original TV series with a clear inspiration change the story itself? Let's start with the most obvious departure from the show's source material. All the characters are related. In my research on how the show was received upon its release, I came across this BuzzFeed article from 2018 titled, "The Real Horror at the Heart of the Haunting of Hill House Isn't What the Netflix Show Thinks It Is" by Sadie Graham. The article talks about the use of family in these two stories. It's a really great article that goes much deeper into the queer analysis of both the show and the source novel, but I want to highlight the main point, which is the contrasting ways in which these two stories view family. Hill House, the show, believes deeply in the sanctity of the family unit. What is most horrifying is the possibility that the family unit can be destroyed. Hill House, the novel, asks whether the structure of the family itself is horrifying. From the moment the novel begins, we're given descriptions of horrifying family units, from Eleanor's cruel mother and her judgmental and controlling siblings, to the previous Hill House residents whose lives are filled with dead wives, cruel husbands, careless nurses, and decaying, unsatisfying old age. For the remainder of the story, Eleanor attempts to find a sense of family and belonging through these people and in this house.
These people are my friends. I'm one of them. I belong.
For Graham, this anti-family ideology is central to the theme of Hill House, saying, the idea that family is a space of safety and love is less intuited than we are told it should be. For many people who are queer, disabled, victims of abuse, or even just, as Graham puts it, girls at the bottom of the social and familial food chain, family is not inherently the safe, healing space it is for others. But for the characters of Mike Flanagan's Hill House, family is a magical, healing force, and this is what is truly punctuated in the line, "Whatever walks there, walks together." And there isn't necessarily anything wrong with this story. I myself am a sucker for a familial melodrama. In fact, in the process of making this video, I kept trying to screen record certain scenes of the show, but getting so sucked in, I accidentally recorded way beyond where I intended to stop. But returning to viewing it as an adaptation, the specific changes and omissions Flanagan makes in adapting the characters makes me think that little care or thought was given to the original story and why it resonated with so many audiences. Look, for example, at Eleanor. Eleanor is the main character of the Haunting of Hill House book and Robert Weiss's faithful adaptation, The Haunting. The film and book both follow Eleanor's descent into madness as she's introduced to Hill House. Her neurosis is rooted in her lack of worldly experience, as she's spent her whole life as a caregiver for her sick mother. After her mother passes, she moves in with her brother and his wife, who refuse to give her any sort of freedom or personal space. Frustrated at her lack of agency and racked with guilt over the relief she feels at her mother's death, she steals her brother's car to meet the mysterious Dr. Montague, who has invited her to Hill House. As she and Theodora develop a distinct romantic attraction at the house,
we're going to be great friends, Theo.
Like sisters?
her guilt and paranoia spiral out of control. Her mental illness stems from her growing agency over her life, conflicting with her guilt over her past actions and her internalized homophobia.
The world is full of inconsistencies, unnatural things. Nature's mistakes, they're called. You, for instance.
In the TV show, Eleanor's internal struggle is comparatively underdeveloped. Whereas the original Eleanor's illness came from her expanding agency, Nell's sleep paralysis strips her of her agency as it gets stronger and turns her character into a simple romantic tragedy. Her arc is defined not by her character's story, but how her character's story impacts the rest of the family. Her sleep paralysis is revealed not to be a mental illness at all, but rather a ghost that has been following her from Hill House. Eleanor's mental illness in the original is multifaceted and complex, stemming from both supernatural influence from the house as well as her own guilt and trauma.
It's not at all like Mother knocking on the wall. It's only a noise.
Theo repeatedly implies that Eleanor killed her mother in order to escape her care. Eleanor becomes overwrought with anger anytime it's suggested that she return to her brother and sister-in-law, but she is simultaneously terrified of the supernatural events occurring in the house. As a result, she's constantly second-guessing herself, and much of the story is unclear about whether the threat is coming from the house or Eleanor's own mind. Her story is rooted in the frustrations of being powerless against the roles she's been cast in her life, daughter, caregiver, sister, but now being helpless without those roles to figure out who she truly is. She wants to feel like a valued member of a family with these strangers she's met in Hill House, but she doesn't truly understand what family is or what her role in it should be. By simplifying Eleanor's character, Flanagan turns Nell into nothing more than a plot device, using her mental illness and her romance simply as a narrative tool to fuel the other characters' growth, effectively ignoring the themes of the original story. The original Eleanor is an exploration of caregiver trauma, confused sexuality, and uncertain identity. Netflix Nell is a tragic martyr who only exists to narratively develop the other characters. Then there's Theo. One of the few consistencies from the book to the movie to the TV show is Theo's sexuality, though they're all still markedly different. Now, I'm not going to debate what the right or wrong way to depict a lesbian character is, but I do want to discuss how the depictions differ. Shirley Jackson's novel was released in 1959, and Robert Weiss's film was released in 1963, which is right at the tail end of the Hays Code's rule over Hollywood. As a result, queer characters like Theodora couldn't be explicitly labeled as lesbian, but instead had to have elements of queerness woven intricately into the characters themselves. In the novel, Theodora is described as bohemian and having traveled to Hill House after having an argument with her female roommate. In the film, Theodora is given a unique style compared to the other characters and is immediately flirtatious with Eleanor.
I'd like to drink to just us, good companions.
Excellent. To my new companion.
When she's asked what her greatest fear is, she replies,
Of knowing what I really want.
So, while Theodora isn't explicitly seen kissing another woman or declaring herself a lesbian, the film isn't exactly subtle about her attractions either.
You married?
No.
The Netflix series, alternatively, was under no restrictions for depicting Theo's sexuality. The series shows her dancing at a club before taking a woman back to her house to have sex. In a flashback, it's revealed that she came out to her family at Eleanor's wedding when Steve and Eleanor caught her hooking up with a bridesmaid.
I mean, we didn't know you were into
bridesmaids?
Theo in the Netflix series feels just like the other characters, she just happens to have sex with women. In film and television studies, this kind of character is called post-gay, where without the need to queer-code a character, gay characters in media have less queer culture and identity written into them and focused instead on how they exist outside of their sexuality. Some people praised this depiction of Theo. One article from Mashable titled "The Haunting of Hill House is an overdue victory for badass lesbians everywhere" celebrates the series allowing Theodora to be a richly developed lesbian character. However, there are some downfalls to this depiction. For one, the character becomes much more sexualized. Her lesbianism is shown through her sexual experiences, both with the girl from the club and the bridesmaid at the wedding. When she finally decides to enter a relationship at the end of the show, we don't really get to see any of that. Compare this to Theo in the movie. She's dressed and styled differently from the other characters. We see her romantic side through her relationship with Eleanor, and we also see hints at her own internal struggle with her identity. This isn't to say Netflix Theo is unflawed or that she just connects fine with the other family members. However, the show is very clearly terrified to engage with Theo's identity beyond just showing her sex life. In the previously mentioned BuzzFeed article, Graham writes, "The show frames queer alienation as an internal quality, reducible to a character flaw, rather than the result of homophobia that structures our cultural conception of domesticity. Theo's sexuality feels more like an effort to shoehorn diversity into the show rather than a purposeful choice. Make no mistake, I'm not saying that Theo is underdeveloped or that her story needs to revolve around her queerness in order to be valid. It's always a good thing to see queer characters whose stories don't just revolve around their sexuality. And the Theo of the TV series does give the show an element of positive representation, especially as it's so rare to see a queer character be unconditionally loved and supported by their family. But representing Theo's character like this also strips the overarching show of the queer and romantic themes that are overtly present in the film and book. Had the series been an original story, it would be much less blatant how the show fails in representing this character. As an adaptation, so much more is removed from Theo than is added. But I also want to look at the changes the TV series made to Theo's powers. In the original, Theo's psychic abilities are loosely defined.
You've been thinking of changing your hair, and I know just the style for you.
Why, yes, I was.
She's able to occasionally read others' thoughts, as well as experience vague physical sensations related to the paranormal occurrences in the house. Alternatively, in the TV series, Theo's powers are very clearly defined as the ability to experience a person or object's history through touch.
You didn't. You can tell? With your hand?
This eroticizes Theo, reducing her power to her body than her mind. We see this most evidently in the episode where Theo investigates the foster parents of one of her patients. When she goes into the basement, she lies down on a couch only to discover that the foster father raped her patient. We watch her lie there, silently screaming as her body rocks up and down, being psychically assaulted. Theo's mother, Olivia, also has psychic powers, and hers become present through debilitating migraines. In one scene, Olivia describes stones being rained down on her house as a child, and this is taken directly from the original, as this is something that happened to Eleanor as a kid. The two depictions are telling of what Flanagan thought of the purpose of these two women. Theo's powers are tactile and bodily, and when combined with her character's lesbianism being reduced solely to her sex life, she becomes the show's sex appeal.
I don't feel anything.
That's okay, then take it.
No, I don't feel anything else.
Olivia's powers affect her head because the character became confused and violent, her hysteria leading to the breakup of the family in the beginning of the show. This becomes especially pertinent with the knowledge that migraines are a medical condition that primarily affects women. Theo and Olivia's powers exist only to physically torture them in ways that directly correlate to them being women.
I'm fine. Oh my God, don't touch me!
In the original, Theo's powers help increase the horror and unease of the house and also serve to increase her sense of isolation. And while she does experience some fear and discomfort as a result, there's no physical torture to go along with it. Thus far, I've only talked about the female characters of the show, and I do want to acknowledge that it's not just the women of the show who are suffering. Luke, in particular, is shown struggling with addiction throughout the series, but Luke's addiction is one of the elements of the show that is unique to the show. Luke in the novel and film is just a spoiled, happy-go-lucky rich kid who happened to be a distant inheritor of Hill House. This change from the source to the Netflix series is one example of how the show truly thrives in its originality. Luke's struggle with addiction and how this affects his relationship with his family is just one of the things that brings so much value and depth to Flanagan's Hill House, as is Steve's struggle to make sense of his feelings surrounding his family.
You don't know the guy that the wrong parent died!
Where the show flounders is when it tries to bring elements of the original Haunting of Hill House into this narrative. Eleanor's paranoia and Theo's sexuality and psychic abilities become lackluster only when juxtaposed against the source material. By making the show an adaptation of The Haunting of Hill House, the show forces this contextualization that hinders it where it could have flourished as an original story. This is why it's important to understand that horror movies aren't just scary stories. Horror with deeper meanings and purposes isn't just a trend that started with the Babadook and elevated horror. You can't simply adapt a ghost story for the ghosts without understanding the significance of the story both from its creators and its fans. I think Flanagan's Hill House is a moving story about a family overcoming shared trauma with moments that are both emotional and terrifying. And if it were an original story, it would be just that. But as an adaptation, the show becomes a careless retelling of a classic story. There's nothing wrong with a horror story being about a straight man or being about a nuclear family, but to use that story as a replacement for a story that is so historically meaningful to women and queer people just makes me disappointed. I wish I could enjoy Flanagan's Hill House for what it is, but sometimes I struggle to do that when it exists in such direct opposition to the original story.